In the spring of 1942, the sun of the rising sun cast a shadow that stretched across a third of the globe. From the jungles of Burma to the frozen islands of the Aleutians, the Empire of Japan was a triumphant, seemingly invincible force. The shock of Pearl Harbor still echoed in the halls of Washington. The great fortresses of Singapore and Corregidor had fallen. The British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse lay at the bottom of the South China Sea. The Dutch East Indies and their precious oil were in Japanese hands. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the Teikoku Kaigun, was the undisputed master of the Pacific, a blade of such exquisite sharpness and skill that it had not lost a single significant naval engagement in modern history. A dangerous national euphoria, a victory disease, shoribyo, had taken hold in Tokyo. The war, it was believed, was all but won. In a Spartan office in Pearl Harbor, recently salvaged from the wreckage of the December 7th attack, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the new commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, stared at a map that was a testament to defeat. His fleet was a ghost of its former self. His battleships were sunk or crippled. He had no new ships, no fresh reserves of trained pilots. All he had were 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the grievously wounded Yorktown, against the 6 fleet carriers of Japan's elite strike force, the Kido Butai. To the men in Tokyo, the American fleet was a broken remnant, a final piece to be swept from the board before the empire could consolidate its vast new domain. And the man who would design the broom was the most brilliant naval strategist of his generation, Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto was a paradox, a gambler who understood odds, a warrior who knew America's industrial might firsthand from his time as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew that a long war with the United States was unwinnable. His entire strategy from Pearl Harbor onward was based on a single desperate premise: to inflict such a catastrophic, humiliating defeat upon the U.S. Navy that the American public, demoralized and isolationist at heart, would sue for a negotiated peace, leaving Japan its Pacific empire. Now he planned the final, decisive blow. The Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle that was the holy grail of Japanese naval doctrine. His target was a tiny, insignificant coral atoll northwest of Hawaii, a place called Midway. The plan, Operation MI, was a masterpiece of complexity and, in its own way, of arrogance. It was a symphony of deception and overwhelming force, involving virtually the entire combined fleet. A small force would create a diversion by attacking the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, hopping to draw Nimitz's carriers north. Then, the main body, including the world's largest battleship, the Yamato, would close in on Midway. The centerpiece was the Kido Butai, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the very same 6 carriers and veteran pilots that had devastated Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Huryu, and the newer Shikaku and Zuikaku. They would soften up Midway's defenses, and when the American carriers, presumably rushing from Pearl Harbor to save the island, arrived, they would be ambushed and annihilated. The plan was flawless. It was an intricate, perfectly calibrated watch mechanism. But it had one fatal flaw. It assumed the enemy was deaf, blind, and stupid. It assumed the Americans would have no idea it was coming. Half a world away from the polished decks of the Yamato, in a windowless, soundproofed basement in Pearl Harbor, a different kind of war was being fought. There were no guns, no uniforms, only the stale smell of coffee, cigarettes, and sweat. This was Station HYPO, the Combat Intelligence Unit. Its commander was a man as far from the spit-and-polish naval ideal as one could imagine. Commander Joseph J. Rochefort was an eccentric genius, a driven, obsessive master of puzzles who often worked for days on end in his bathrobe and slippers. He and his team of cryptanalysts, a motley crew of brilliant mathematicians, linguists, and even a musician, were engaged in the most critical intellectual battle of the war, breaking the Japanese Navy's operational code, JN-25. JN-25 was a complex super-encrypted code. Breaking it was like trying to assemble a million-piece jigsaw puzzle in the dark, with most of the pieces missing. But by the spring of 1942, Rochefort's team had begun to see patterns. They were not reading full messages, but rather picking up fragments, whispers in the static of Japanese radio traffic, a date here, a ship's call sign there, a geographic grid coordinate. In late April, the whispers grew into a roar. The fragments all pointed to a massive, impending operation. They intercepted messages mentioning a huge concentration of ships, an invasion force, and the involvement of the entire Kido Butai. The plan's objective was designated by a two-letter code, AF. The fate of the Pacific War now rested on a single question: what and where was AF? In Washington, D.C., the codebreakers at Station HYPO were convinced AF was in the South Pacific, perhaps the Aleutians or even the U.S. West Coast. They viewed Rochefort's team in Hawaii as provincial upstarts. The bureaucratic friction was immense. Washington's analysts, far from the front, trusted their own calculations. Rochefort, living and breathing the Pacific theater, trusted his intuition. He was certain AF was Midway. He had seen fragmentary intercepts mentioning an objective near Hawaii, and Midway was the logical sentry for the islands. But intuition wasn't enough. He needed proof. He needed a single, undeniable fact that would force Nimitz to risk his entire fleet on a hunch. What happened next was an act of brilliant, almost roguish ingenuity. It was a trap laid not with mines or submarines, but with information. Acting on a suggestion from one of his junior officers, Rochefort devised a ruse of stunning simplicity. He had the naval base at Midway use an insecure underwater cable to send a message en clair, unencrypted, to Pearl Harbor. The message was designed to be intercepted by the Japanese. It stated that the island's fresh water distillation plant had suffered a major breakdown, and they were critically short on fresh water. The bait was in the water. Rochefort and his team held their breath and listened. A few days later, their vigil was rewarded. A Japanese intelligence outpost dutifully sent a coded message to the combined fleet headquarters. When Rochefort's team painstakingly decrypted the fragment, their hearts pounded. The message read, "AF is short on fresh water." It was the single sheet of paper, the impossible truth. The death sentence written not in numbers but in two simple letters. Rochefort now knew with absolute certainty. The Japanese were walking into a trap and he held the key. He immediately went to Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz now faced a decision of terrifying magnitude. His own intelligence chiefs in Washington were telling him Rochefort was wrong. His fleet was shattered. The carrier Yorktown, heavily damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, was considered a write-off, needing 3 months of repairs. He was outnumbered more than 2-to-1 in carriers and massively outgunned in every other ship class. To accept Rochefort's intelligence was to commit his entire remaining naval force to a battle against impossible odds, based on the word of an eccentric in a basement. To reject it and believe Washington would be to send his carriers steaming in the wrong direction while Midway was crushed, leaving Hawaii and the entire West Coast vulnerable. In that moment, Chester Nimitz demonstrated a quality that defined true leadership. He looked past the bureaucracy and the conflicting reports. He looked at the man before him, Joe Rochefort, and he made a judgment not of the data, but of the man's character and conviction. He chose to trust the oddball in the bathrobe over the admirals in Washington. He made his bet. He would stake the future of the war on the belief that AF was Midway. "I want you to get this ship back in the water in 3 days," he told the engineers at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, pointing to the crippled Yorktown. In a Herculean effort that became a legend of the war, 1,400 workers swarmed the ship, working around the clock. They patched the hull, replaced steel plates, and jury-rigged entire systems. In 72 hours, the carrier that should have been in dry dock for months steamed out of Pearl Harbor under its own power to rendezvous with Enterprise and Hornet. Nimitz had scraped together every plane and pilot he could find. He had his 3 carriers. The trap was set. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the sun rose over a placid Pacific Sea. On the bridge of his flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo felt the familiar confidence of a commander who had never known defeat. His reconnaissance had reported no American ships in the area. The Aleutian diversion had, he believed, worked perfectly. At 04:30, he launched his first strike of over 100 aircraft to neutralize Midway Island. The attack was devastating, but the American defenders, forewarned by Rochefort's intelligence, put up a ferocious resistance. The Japanese strike leader radioed back a fateful message. The island's air defenses were still active. A second strike was needed. This message placed Nagumo in the grip of a terrible dilemma. His doctrine was rigid. His reserve planes on the carrier decks were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, ready for an engagement with enemy ships. But a second strike on a land target required high-explosive fragmentation bombs. To change the ordnance was a complex and time-consuming process, taking over an hour. While his men worked frantically on the hangar decks, carts laden with bombs and torpedoes crisscrossing the space, a scout plane that had been delayed on takeoff sent a shocking report. 10 enemy ships sighted. Nagumo was paralyzed. Bombs for the island or torpedoes for the ships. He hesitated, then gave the order to halt the rearming process and switch back to torpedoes. His decks were now a chaotic mess of fuel lines, unsecured ordnance, and exhausted men. He had made a critical mistake, but the greatest was yet to come. He had fatally underestimated his enemy's resolve. What followed was one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in naval history. The first American planes to find the Japanese fleet were the TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. They were slow, obsolete, and hopelessly outmatched by the legendary Japanese Zero fighters. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet attacked without fighter cover. They were annihilated. All 15 planes were shot down. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, clinging to a seat cushion in the water. Then came the torpedo squadrons from the Enterprise and Yorktown. They too were slaughtered. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Kido Butai that morning, 37 were shot down, and they failed to score a single hit. To Nagumo and his officers, it was a massacre, further proof of American incompetence. But this sacrifice, seemingly so futile, had a profound and unseen consequence. In their eagerness to destroy the low-flying torpedo planes, the entire Japanese combat air patrol, the protective umbrella of Zero fighters, had been drawn down to sea level, chasing the last of the devastators. The skies directly above the Japanese fleet were, for a few crucial minutes, completely empty. And at that exact moment, high above, at 17,000 feet, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, was on the verge of turning back. His fuel was critically low. He had reached the projected intercept point and found nothing but empty ocean. He had made a guess, a command decision to continue searching for just a little longer. And then he saw it, a tiny white wake on the blue canvas below. It was a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, steaming at high speed to rejoin the main fleet after having driven off an American submarine. McCluskey made another fateful choice. He turned his entire squadron to follow the destroyer. A few minutes later, through a break in the clouds, he saw it. The entire Kido Butai turning into the wind, their decks perfectly spotted with planes preparing to launch the strike that would annihilate the American carriers. It was the single most perfect moment of vulnerability in the history of naval warfare. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. Attack! Attack! What followed was not a battle, it was an execution. The dauntless bombers tipped over into their screaming 70-degree dives. For the Japanese sailors below, they appeared out of the sun like bolts from a vengeful god. The Zeros were still at sea level, helpless to intervene. The first bomb struck Nagumo's flagship, the Akagi. They ripped through the flight deck and exploded among the fully fueled and armed planes in the hangar below. The ship was instantly transformed into a raging inferno. Seconds later, bombs slammed into the Kaga. Then bombers from the Yorktown found the Soryu. In less than 5 minutes, the 3 carriers that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were shattered, burning wrecks. The heart of the Kido Butai had been ripped out. The battle was not quite over. The sole remaining Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, launched a desperate and skillful counterattack, crippling the Yorktown. But American scouts soon found the Hiryu, and dive bombers from the Enterprise sent her to the bottom as well. The final tally was staggering. Japan lost 4 of its finest fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, and over 3,000 men, including more than 250 of its most skilled and irreplaceable veteran pilots. The United States lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and a destroyer. The balance of power in the Pacific had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. The failure at Midway was not a failure of Japanese courage or skill. It was a catastrophic failure of imagination. The Japanese leadership, blinded by the hubris of their own success, had crafted a perfect plan against a caricature of an enemy. They were defeated not by a superior fleet, but by a superior idea. They were defeated by the quiet, thankless work of men in a basement who listened to whispers in the static. They were defeated by an admiral who had the wisdom to trust his people. The story of Midway is the ultimate testament to the principle that in warfare, the most devastating weapon is not a ship, a plane, or a bomb. It is a single, verified, and properly understood fact. The Japanese Empire was brought to its knees not by steel alone, but by a simple message about a broken water condenser, a truth its leaders were too proud to ever conceive was possible. The course of history was changed forever, not in a grand clash of battleships, but in the 5 minutes it took for a handful of planes to fall out of the sky, guided there by the ghosts of broken codes.